Western politicians are now claiming that the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, may now officially declare war on the country that he invaded, and that he'll do this in the next week or so. That would mean he would no longer be claiming that he's conducting just a special military operation in Ukraine, but would actually say that a state of war exists between Russia and Ukraine. It may just sound like words, but it may be important. It might make it easier for him to call up reserves and to use conscripts in Ukraine, for example. Roland Henwoon is a lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. Roland, good afternoon to you. How significant would it be for Russia to make a declaration of war with Ukraine? What would it really mean?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Yes, that would be significant in that it is going to officially change what is perceived, especially from within Russia, what is perceived to be the situation on the ground. There are three issues. Firstly, the expectation is that this may happen on the 9th of May, which is Victory Day in Russia. And that goes back to the end of the Second World War and the Russian forces being victorious against Germany. So historically a very important day, also in terms of military history. Secondly, that announcement, if it comes, is going to change the context. It's no longer a small military operation that has to a large extent been kept off the radar and been presented as something that is actually just aimed at protecting Russian interests and cultural relationships and issues like that. This then makes it a proper full-scale war, basically saying that Russia now has taken the decision to attack Ukraine, which will be a first acknowledgement of this actually happening, and then opening the door to the mobilization of more forces, conscripts, and more resources, which is probably necessary at this stage because it seems that what was expected originally to happen in terms of the Russian military operation is just not getting anywhere. So it would significantly change the context. And thirdly, it would probably make it possible for a much larger warfare to be enacted and for much bigger operations to be launched, if that is what President Putin still desires.
There's several things that would also happen. I would imagine politically, I don't know that much about the Russian political system, but the Russian parliament, the Duma, would also perhaps be involved. So, for example, in the American system, the president doesn't declare war, Congress does, even though the president can order, soldiers to go and invade a country, and has done so. But what I'm saying is that when the Russian parliament then would have to, I presume, back that decision, that also means that there's a domestic politics at play here. It would allow Putin to say that his country is at a state of war. That might give him power.
Yes, correctly, and also important indications are that this may bolster the legitimacy of Putin and his military engagement with Ukraine and probably get him a little bit more public support. But the key here will be how he's going to sell the idea. And what has been clear is there's a build-up in terms of a argument that it's a war against the Nazis. So not only the symbolism of the 9th of May, but also the historical context of we are again threatened by Nazis and we have to rid the world of these Nazis because they threaten Russian sovereignty and security. And that's quite important. We must remember that it was Hitler that attacked Russia and caused lots of problems, destruction, and serious problems for the Russians before that eventual victory over Nazi Germany. So the symbolism of this is quite important, and that is why it's probably going to happen in this way and why it's going to be used in this way to get that legitimacy and support and then make possible not only the political go-ahead, but also the resources that are required, because there's a clear indication that the war is not going the way it was planned and envisaged by especially the Russians.
I mean, you remind me, I think it was 20 million Russian people were killed in World War II, the Great Patriotic War as it's called in Russia. I mean, you can just imagine the power of that. Is there another thing? So if you conduct a special military operation, and that's all you're doing, as a leader, you can decide when that special military operation is over, you can recall your troops. And what I'm trying to say is you could hypothetically go into Ukraine and come out again relatively easily. When you declare that a state of war now exists between my country, Russia, and the next door country, Ukraine, is it harder for Putin to end it?
Not necessarily. I think one must be very realistic. And if we look at the recent changes, and with recent time, I look at the last 4 or 5 years especially, there were significant changes to the constitution and the institutions of government, essentially placing that under the control of President Putin. And he is unfettered in his decision-making and where he wants to go. He will get the support that he wants. What it does change is the perception of the war. Instead of an unruly mob of oppositionists that are causing all sorts of fairly small scale, but still some problems, and forces him to answer, and people in government to answer questions that they probably didn't want to answer up to now, this changes the context completely. The country is at war, and that normally implies that the rules of the game change also at the national level. So you have more power, more authority to do what you want, and to essentially stop anything from going and anyone from opposing you. So although he does not have the limitations that we would see in other Western European countries, it does give him a different engagement, a different level of authority, and different means of dealing with whatever is presented as a challenge to him.
So, I mean, if you accept what the West says about him, it allows him to be more of a dictator. I mean, you could easily argue that what happened when the United States invaded Iraq meant that certain Americans no longer questioned their government. It has the same sort of impact.
Yes, that's the same impact, but I think it's actually a few steps above what we see happening. In the U.S., you still have some legitimate and legislative powers and controls despite what happens. And you had serious pushback after that in the U.S., changes to regulations that limited the president's ability to deploy troops. And that goes into the future. We don't see any of that happening in Russia. And again, one must look at the longer historical context. This is not the first time President Putin has used these forces in a way that has been playing out in Ukraine. He did it in Moldova, he did it in Chechnya in a way, but he's also done it in other parts, Georgia, etc. So there's a long history of using the military to achieve political objectives outside of the Russian motherland. And that's the issue here. He does not have the same limitations and pressures that other governments in more democratic systems would face.
So then, and you've mentioned this already, the issues around the Russian military. I mean, the Western media organizations, people like The Economist, I mean, every day CNN will have an opinion piece claiming that, you know, the Russian military is failing. Is that just sort of, you know, Western triumphalism? Look how bad they are, you know. I can't do an American accent, but I think you know what I mean. Or is there something actually in that? Is the Russian military really failing on the level that the West keeps claiming it is?
I think there are different dimensions that one has to look at here. Firstly, the expectation that was created by Mr. Putin himself over the last number of years with a drive to modernize the Russian military, with frequent announcements of new technological breakthroughs of weapon systems that no one else has access to, only Russia and the Russian military. And then also continuously putting pressure on especially NATO with military flights close to borders, political grandstanding in a way, if one looks back, and threatening, putting pressure on European states not to do certain things. Given that, and then the build-up of the Russian forces and the intelligence that was available, and there are two issues here. Firstly, there's a lot of propaganda. This is a war that also has a significant component in the electronic sphere and in the media sphere. So there's a lot of propaganda from all over. However, the second dimension is the use and the availability of credible intelligence to, in a sense, preempt what is happening. And if one looks at what President Biden especially has been doing, he has been preempting what Putin has done and what's happened in the Ukraine, often by a number of days. And so far, he has not been proven wrong. And I think that's the backdrop against what one must use to interpret what is happening. If we look at these factors and then the use of the Russian military, the numbers, and there were very clear intelligence on the numbers, the units, etc., that were amassed on the borders and that were going to be deployed in Ukraine. The expectation was that Ukraine would be overrun within literally 2 to 3 days. That did not happen. Not only did that not happen, we have seen significant pushback, firstly holding the line against the Russian forces, and then pushback. Some important short-term or maybe small military successes by the Ukrainians, but the combination of these have stalled the Russian advance, have stalled what was expected of Russia. And then you had the sudden fallback of Russian forces from Kiev, for instance, saying that, but this was not our objective. We've reached what we wanted to. In a military context, that's very difficult to gauge because you don't really know what was the objective, but the expected objective, as also explained by Putin, was to decapitate the Ukrainian leadership and take control of the country and have a different government. That did not happen. Also, the credible information on what is going on within the Russian forces, the number of very senior military commanders that have been killed or wounded in action, all of those indicate that this war has not gone the way it was expected. And I'm using the word expected because I don't know exactly what the Russian military plan was, but it clearly is not playing out the way that it was expected in terms of credible intelligence that has been shared quite broadly and widely in the world. So there is pressure, and then one starts looking at what is happening within Russia, the expected announcement, the build-up, using different language, using a very emotive, symbolic legitimization of the war, and then the expected broadening of the war. Of course, this opens a set of other issues, and we've seen the pushback globally, but especially from countries such as Israel, on the use of the Nazi idea and the revisionist interpretation of history around Germany and Nazism in the last days by the Foreign Minister Lavrov. So there's a lot of issues playing out that indicates something else is going to happen, and probably that is explained shortly by saying what happens is not what was planned and it's not what was expected.
Within all of this, and you've explained sort of all of the upside of a declaration of war for Putin, so more power domestically, all of these things. And I think on all of that, that must be correct. Is there also a risk, so if he goes into an official state of war with Ukraine, he uses reservists, he uses conscripts, and first he said there were no Russian conscripts in Ukraine. It turned out there were, they all went back again. But that also increases the risk of more and more soldiers in Ukraine, more and more Russian soldiers dying in Ukraine, things happening to conscripts, for example. I mean, conscripts aren't really soldiers. I mean, they are, but they aren't necessarily able to fight against more experienced people. And so in the end, he weakens the Russian military, which the United States has stated, maybe by mistake, but stated that's what it wants to do. It wants to weaken the Russian military. It's going to use Ukraine to do it. I can't imagine how the Ukrainians felt.
Well, I mean, that's one of the issues, and you will always have unintended consequences. So on the one hand, this is the next option that is available to you in a desperate situation, if that is the case, and you have to escalate. Otherwise, the consequences are probably going to be dire for you in any case. So now you escalate, but that escalation increases the risks domestically and externally. You now put your country on a war footing. You have to legitimize the war, explain why now. Why against a country that actually is your brethren in a cultural, historic sense? So that's going to take some doing, and not the Nazi symbolism may not necessarily be enough in the long run, especially if you have more information coming out by deploying more troops and the negatives comes out. And we've seen that happen already, where Russian troops have gone out in public saying, but we cannot do this. We cannot do this to the Ukrainian people. They are our brothers and sisters.
Roland Henwoon.
So you run the military risks, you run the political risks, but you also run the risks on the humanitarian side.
Roland Henwood,
Also, a
I'm afraid
declaration of war
we are going to have
opens
to leave it
different
there, I'm afraid.
international law issues.
Roland Henwood is a lecturer at the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, as you can hear, an expert on this. Roland, thank you very much.